Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly radio show that airs on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio. Don't live in Santa Fe? You can get KSFR shows and this radio show by going to ksfr.org, and it streams live from there. So you can listen to this show and other KSFR programming by just streaming it, and you can stream it from Las Cruces, Silver City, Taos, Europe, wherever. You can listen anytime. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today I'll be speaking with Gail Evans, the lead attorney who spent 2 years developing the recently filed lawsuit designed to force the state to take adequate steps. Actually, any steps would be an improvement to more effectively regulate and assess penalties for the gas and oil industry's wanton spewing of methane and leaking of toxic water. I'll get to Gail in a moment, but first a few short announcements. Last week, I spoke with Representative Andrea Romero, and we discussed the recent spate of gun violence and the gun violence that occurred in Farmington. We also discussed other matters germane to the New Mexico State Legislature in the 2023 legislative session. Andrea and I discussed what tools the legislature has to address these recurrent tragedies, what got done in the 2023 session, and what more needs to get done and the barriers to getting that done. So I recommend you checking out that on our website. I want to remind you that if you are listening to this show while driving around town and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior show by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the lower right side of the homepage. You'll find recordings of all our previous shows listed in chronological order. Retake takes pride in delivering compelling interviews on important topics. So when on the Retake on the Radio page, take some time to review some old interviews. As we announced in our last blog, Retake is taking a 6-month hiatus so Roxanne and I can have time and energy to address some long overlooked personal aspirations and to restore balance to our lives. We've been doing this work since the fall of 2015, and we aren't getting any younger. So it is time to figure out how to make Retake a permanent advocacy organization. We feel pretty strongly that what we are doing now and how we're doing it is simply not sustainable. Yet we also feel that the platform we've developed warrants being sustained. So stay tuned. During the hiatus, we will use this show to update you on our progress, and as possible, offer timely alerts on emerging political and policy news. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from them for their custodial care for land, water, and air. We better learn fast. And I want to apologize for my voice. This week, Roxanne and I have both been hit by a particularly nasty dose of COVID. I'm a little further along in recovery than she is, but she's feeling better as well, so not to worry. Just might, I might wind up coughing a bit in this. I haven't talked for 30 minutes in a while. Well, welcome, Gail. How are you?
I am well. Thank you, Paul. I'm glad you're feeling better.
Yes. Thank you very much. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a couple minutes to tell us who you are, why you became an attorney, and how you are applying those skills to address injustices in New Mexico.
Yeah, my name's Gail Evans. I'm a senior attorney with an organization called the Center for Biological Diversity. I live here in New Mexico in Albuquerque. I went to law school at UNM about 30 years ago. I've practiced law here my entire career. I started off as a death penalty defense attorney with the New Mexico Public Defender's Office. I went on to be the legal director at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty for a long time, where we did systemic work to address issues that impacted low-income New Mexicans, like access to healthcare, workers' rights, immigrant rights, education rights. And I went on recently to join the Center for Biological Diversity so that I could address issues around oil and gas production and pollution in New Mexico and how it impacts people's health and the climate.
Okay. So as noted in the intro to the show, you just spent 2 years developing a lawsuit to challenge the state to do more to protect our environment. Can you tell us about the conditions that caused you to develop this lawsuit and what it would do if you are successful? Put another way, what is the problem that the lawsuit is designed to address?
So we have an oil and gas pollution crisis here in New Mexico. In the last decade, oil production has increased tenfold in our state, and gas production has also increased enormously, and it's making us the second largest oil producing state in the nation and one of the top gas producing states. And we hear a lot about the money that our state gets from this oil and gas production. We don't hear so much about the pollution and the harms that come with that production. We pay a high price. We pay with our health. We pay with our children's health. We pay with a very poor air quality, especially in regions of the state where there's heavy oil and gas production. Our air quality is not even in compliance with basic federal health standards. We pay with contamination to our land and our water. There's about 1,400 spills every year of toxic liquid waste that soaks into our land and into our groundwater. We pay with the depletion of our freshwater resources. The oil and gas industry uses billions of gallons of our fresh water every year. And we pay with our future because oil and gas production in New Mexico actually does have an impact on the global climate crisis. So it's these conditions that were really brought to my attention by frontline community members, meaning people who live near fracking sites, especially indigenous people who live out in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation on the Greater Chaco landscape. They live, literally their livestock are grazing over fracking wells. They have had produced water spills contaminate their groundwater right by their homes. This is just going on unchecked in our state, and we needed to find a solution. And frankly, going to the legislature was not a solution in New Mexico. And trying to enforce laws that are on the books was not a solution because we don't have laws on the books that we can go to court with to make the state do more to regulate this virtually untethered industry in our state. So we had to look to our state constitution. And in New Mexico, we actually have a really strong constitution. It's one of our state's strengths. We have rights in that constitution that are not in the federal constitution, that are not in other states' constitutions. We have this thing called the pollution control clause in our constitution. It's been in our constitution since 1971. That's over 50 years. No one has ever tried to enforce this pollution control clause. And it actually says that the legislature shall control pollution to prevent the despoilment of our air, our water, and other natural resources. And it talks about the fundamental importance of our beautiful and healthful environment and really guarantees that to all New Mexicans. So a group of frontline community members, indigenous people, and young people came together to bring this case to hold the state accountable to its constitutional duty to control oil and gas pollution.
Right. So in preparation for this interview, I read an article by The Source, and it cited some of your plaintiffs and their life experience with pollution. And it seems like you've gone out of your way to make sure you have plaintiffs who represent underserved communities and indigenous communities. Because among those co-plaintiffs are Daniel Tso, Mario Attencio, and Kendra Pinto. Can you describe why those individuals are referenced in the suit and describe some of their direct experiences? Mario Attencio's is especially horrific and compelling.
Yeah, so these are all people who live out in the eastern agency of the Navajo Nation, sort of that area between like Cuba and Bloomfield, if you're driving up 550. They are people who grew up in this area, have seen the landscape change dramatically, see the devastation that's been caused by all of the fracking that is happening all around where they live. Mario, as you mentioned, his family had a massive spill of toxic liquid waste from a fracking site. Millions of gallons all over his family's land that actually soaked into the groundwater there and contaminated it. All of these folks, and there are others as well involved in the case from that area, have tried for years to get the state to address the air quality issues where they live and the water issues where they live. And they have had virtually no response from the state, and they certainly have not had their issues addressed. They're particularly concerned about all the fracking sites that are around the Liebrook Elementary School, which is right there in Counselor, New Mexico. They report that more and more children now are using asthma inhalers. I know from personal experience when I'm there visiting with them that I have to wear a mask, and this was, before COVID. I was introduced to the KN95 mask, which Mario gave me so that we could go tour around, and I still got a headache, which is what happens to folks when you visit.
So, has the governor or Democratic leadership weighed in on the suit? I'm guessing you didn't get roses sent from the governor or an offer to submit an amicus brief in your. Are you there? Uh-oh. Gail, you're frozen. We'll be back, folks. We got to get Gail back. She had a problem. So we had a little bit of a loss of transmission here. And so if we were repeating a question, Gail didn't hear it. So I'm going to just ask it. Has the governor or Democratic leadership weighed in on this suit? I'm guessing you didn't get roses from the governor or an offer to submit an amicus brief.
So all we've heard from the governor is she did issue a response on the day that we filed. And she said that she was proud of her record of regulating oil and gas. And I would just ask her what record and what regulation. I know the state has passed some air quality regulations in the last few years around controlling methane venting and flaring. Those regulations are not being enforced, and venting and flaring of methane has peaked and is sort of at all-time highs now, even since those rules were passed. And even the secretary of our environment department has made statements about how, passing regulations but not enforcing them, which is what the situation here, if that's the goal, then they're meeting it. But the goal cannot be that, obviously. We need much more.
So what reasons or more accurately excuses have been given for the industry not doing a better job of regulating themselves and behaving more responsibly?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for the industry, but I don't think industry regulates itself. I think that's the job of government to regulate industry. And of course, what we always hear is that if there is regulation, it would somehow impact production and therefore impact the dollars that flow into our state revenue. And of course, that is not true. And if it is true, then it's too high of a price that we pay for that money.
Okay. And what reasons or more accurately excuses does the state give for not being able to do a better job of regulating the industry?
Well, I think the state, they, like I said, they pass rules, but then don't enforce the rules. A few years ago, the state passed a rule making it prohibited to spill toxic liquid waste. But since then, we've had, 1,400, hundreds and hundreds of spills of toxic liquid waste. The state has not issued a single penalty. These spills are not remediated. So the spills continue, even though there's a rule on the book saying that spills are prohibited. So we have an enforcement problem, but we also have a problem that we don't have like mandatory laws in place in New Mexico to protect the environment or our public health from oil and gas pollution. When an operator comes in and applies for a permit to drill in New Mexico, there is no environmental review or public health review before that permit is granted. Like, that question is not asked. The question is just about, you know, how much oil can we get out of the ground? How efficiently can we get it out of the ground? So we don't do the kind of public health and environmental review that would be required before we even grant a new permit. We don't have rules on the books that talk about keeping oil and gas wells away from where people live and work and go to school. You know, other states do this. Our state doesn't do this. So oil and gas wells can be, you know, right up next to, and they are, people's backyards and schools where children are playing and in class.
This is a depressing discussion, but I think we're going to get to some good stuff in a bit. But we need to take a break to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever in the era of misinformation. With so much misinformation in the mainstream and social media and most political rhetoric, no matter what party. In the face of that misinformation, there is KSFR offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of public interest programming to keep you informed and sane in these ever so challenging times. In an era replete with misinformation at KSFR, you get the straight scoop, fact-based news from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, The View from Europe with the BBC, and KSFR's own state and local news. Plus, they offer an array of great music curated by disc jockeys with personality. It's great shows. For me, the most important of KSFR's many contributions are the information discussions on timely issues, from Economic Update with renowned Marxist Richard Wolff, Retake Our Democracy, Native America Calling, and a host of other moderated discussions. Finally, where else can you get an hour of socialist radio every Saturday morning from 8 to 9 a.m., only on KSFR? You may not always agree with the views shared on Retake Our Democracy or Economic Update, but you will always be challenged, and that is an important purpose of public radio. Just a few weeks ago was Pledge Week, and we've fallen a bit short on our goals that must be met if KSFR is to continue delivering the high-quality programming we've all come to expect. So if you appreciate the programming, after you finish listening to the show, please go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and toss $10, $20, or even $50 into the kitty, and think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of welcome programming. While there, consider making it a monthly donation. On behalf of KSFR, I want to thank you for your generosity. Let's get back to our discussion of climate litigation. Attorney Gail Evans. Returning to our discussion of your lawsuit, Gail, what are your counter arguments to respond to the excuses from industry and the state?
So the state actually has a constitutional duty to control pollution. And since the constitutional amendment was passed in 1971, the Pollution Control Clause, the state has not put in place laws or regulations to comply with that constitutional duty. And in fact, over the years, the state has passed other laws that are intended to be environmental protection laws, like the hazardous waste law or the solid waste law, but they explicitly exclude the oil and gas industry and oil and gas pollution from those protections. So instead, the oil and gas industry is primarily regulated by this thing called the Oil and Gas Act, which has been on the books since the 1930s and which doesn't have these environmental protections. So what we say to the state is, you have a positive constitutional duty to act. You need to come forward and do things to control oil and gas pollution. Part of that is putting in place the statutory or regulatory scheme. Part of that is funding the state agencies with what they need to then go out and do their job. We have 9 inspectors in the Oil Conservation Division for over 66,000 wells in this state, right? So we have less inspectors than other states that have far less oil and gas production than we have. So there's both a need to put in place rules that would control pollution, that would protect our environment and our health from oil and gas production. And there's a need to fund agencies so that they have the tools that they need and the power to go out and then enforce those laws. This duty really is on the legislature and on our state leadership, including our governor, who really needs to step up and lead. And to be a climate governor, she needs to lead and control the pollution that comes from this heavy oil and gas production in New Mexico.
Before we began the recording, you mentioned that the governor had a comment in reaction to the lawsuit. Can you share us what that was and what your reaction to it was?
Yes, she said that she was proud of her record regulating oil and gas. And I was saying that, you know, what record is that? What regulation has there actually been? And that we really want to see that. We want to see leadership that would actually impact the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas pollution is the fossil fuel pollution is the leading cause of climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels are the leading cause of climate change. So we have a governor who claims to be a climate governor, a leader in that area, and yet the facts show that New Mexico is actually a significant contributor to the climate crisis. So not only is it significantly harming the health of New Mexicans, and especially our children who are at schools surrounded by fracking sites, but it's also harming the planet and our climate.
And is it not the case that, I mean, I didn't read the lawsuit, but I did read the article about the lawsuit. And it seems like your focus is more on community and public health than climate impact. Is that intentional? I mean, of course it's intentional, but why did you choose that avenue?
Well, it's both, but we are the people who brought this case are directly harmed by oil and gas pollution. And those harms are harms because of the dirty air that they breathe, harms because the land that they live on and the water that they rely on is contaminated, harms because the ancestral landscapes that are sacred to them have been damaged, harm because wildlife and ecosystems where they live have been damaged, and harm because the climate is being damaged. So climate is one of the harms that impacts the clients, the people who brought this lawsuit.
Weren't you also involved in the groundbreaking Yazzie versus New Mexico suit that forced the state to commit more resources to ensure quality K-12 education for all New Mexicans? How and why did that come about, and what impact has that suit had on the quality of public education in New Mexico?
Yeah, I was lead counsel on the Yazzie case when I was the legal director at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. So we brought that case back in 2014. I spent years researching and preparing that case. And it's a similar idea that in our state constitution, it says that the state shall provide a sufficient system of education to all school-age children. And we took the state to court and said, you're not meeting this constitutional duty. You have not put in place a system that provides all children a sufficient education. And similarly here, we're taking the state to court saying, you have not put in place a system that controls pollution from the oil and gas industry, and you have a constitutional duty to do so. And the Yazzie case, you know, we had strong evidence to show how the state hadn't put in place a sufficient system of education, looking at educational outcomes of our children, looking at the lack of programming for our children. What did our children need to succeed in school, and they weren't getting it? Likewise, in this case, we have very strong evidence to show that the state isn't meeting its constitutional duty to control pollution, because we look at the quality of the air, we look at the contamination and the spills, we look at how close fracking sites are to where children live and go to school. And so again, there's strong evidence that the state isn't complying with this constitutional duty to step up and put in place a system to control pollution. So it's a similar framework to the Yazzie case, and another very big problem. We're trying.
So, this is a follow-up to that last question, Gail. On the one hand, the Yazzie suit requires the state to use more financial resources to educate our children, particularly those who are historically underserved. And this new suit would require the state to handcuff the industry, providing 40% of the revenue needed to respond to Yazzie and address other state needs. That puts the state in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it? How can the state do both, or can it?
Yeah, so the state needs to do a major shift, as we all know, away from relying on oil and gas revenue and diversifying our economy and turning the ship towards renewable energy and towards solar and towards wind. There's so much that the state could be doing, and we're not. Instead, we're on this like plowing ahead with increasing oil and gas production. And the science says that all oil and gas production needs to end. We need to be phasing this down if we want to save our planet from the horrors of the climate crisis and stay below this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So in order to be stewards of our planet and in order to protect the health of New Mexicans, we are long overdue in turning our ship away from oil and gas and towards new forms of energy production and revenue. Of course, there's also a lot we could do with our tax structure, which is something we talked about in the Yazzie case. There are lots of options within our tax structure, even going back to the tax structure that we had under pre-Richardson. We used to have a progressive tax structure in this state, and Richardson chipped away, the Richardson administration chipped away at that. The Martinez administration chipped away at that more. Like, even if we went back to our original tax structure from about 20 years ago, that would be a start in terms of taxing the wealthy more, taxing corporations more fairly. That would be a start. And then, of course, turning to solar and wind. How about cleaning up the tens of thousands of inactive wells across our state that continue to emit pollutants? There's lots of work to be done there. So we have lots of options in our state. And frankly, it is just so ironic that we're saying that we're funding our schools and the education of our children with money that is literally poisoning them. So this is not to many of us like a difficult question. Is the money worth? Should our children pay with their health for that oil and gas money? No. So there's a lot the state can do to regulate the industry, to control pollution, and at the same time, we need to be ramping down oil and gas production in New Mexico.
To follow up on that, I'd be a lot more sympathetic to the state if it weren't for the utter failure to explore ways to diversify our economy. And even in the last session, just giving away $1 billion in tax revenue indiscriminately is not a good way to shore up revenues and prepare for a transition. Neither is vetoing legislation to begin pilot exploration of the development of geothermal energy, an important means of weaning us from reliance on gas and oil. If it does nothing else, do you feel that this suit will finally get the state to take some action to begin diversifying its economy and preparing to keep it in the ground? Got about 30 seconds.
Our goal is that the suit is going to push the state to comply with its constitutional duties to control pollution. And yes, in the end, we need to turn towards renewable energy.
Okay, with the little bit of time we have left, can you tell people where they can find out more about the lawsuit and about you?
Yeah, so we have a website called New Mexico nmlandairwatersacred.org. And say that again, nmlandairwatersacred.org. And that is the name of the group of people that came together and brought this case. Of course, there's also information at the Center for Biological Diversity's website, which is biologicaldiversity.org. And I'd also encourage people to look at peopleversusfossilfuels.org, which is part of a federal national movement to address oil and gas pollution.
All right, I want to thank Gail very much for spending time with us today. And good luck with your lawsuit. We'll be following it, and we'll probably have you back again to tell us more. But
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening, listeners. Next week, I'll be back, I think, with Roxanne, if she's feeling up to it. And because we want to update people on what we've been up to besides suffering from COVID.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.